The morning at Lincoln High School began like many others. The big red brick building stood tall against the bright blue sky, with students pouring in through its heavy double doors. Some of them laughed, some whispered about weekend adventures, and others looked tired as they dragged their backpacks through the hallways. Inside room 204, Ms. Michelle Obama was preparing her history lesson. She was not only a teacher but also a mentor to many students. Her classroom always smelled faintly of chalk and old books. On one side of the room, large windows let in the sunlight, and on the other, a bulletin board displayed inspirational quotes and student projects. Michelle had been teaching for several years. She was known for her patience and the way she could make even the most difficult history lessons sound like stories. She believed that every student had potential, even those who often caused trouble. She knew that sometimes bad behavior was just a mask for hidden pain. That morning, Michelle noticed a tension in the room even before the bell rang. She saw Donald walk in. Donald was a senior, tall and broad-shouldered. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from always being the loudest voice in the room. But Michelle also noticed the way his eyes sometimes revealed a tiredness, almost like he was carrying a burden no one else could see. Donald had a reputation. He was the student most teachers dreaded. He often mocked his classmates, interrupted lessons, and ignored rules. Yet deep down, Michelle believed he was capable of change. She thought that if someone could reach him, he might discover a different path for himself. The other students shifted nervously when Donald entered. Some whispered to one another and some simply kept their heads down, not wanting to attract his attention. Donald liked to be noticed, and he usually found a way to make sure all eyes were on him. Michelle smiled warmly at the class. "Good morning, everyone," she said in her calm, steady voice. "Good morning, Miss Obama," most of the students replied together, though a few mumbled sleepily. Donald, however, sat down noisily, dragging his chair across the floor so that the screech echoed through the room. He leaned back, pulled out his phone, and started tapping the screen. His behavior was nothing new, but Michelle knew today she had to address it. She began her lesson by writing on the board. Today we're going to talk about leadership in history. What makes a leader? How do leaders change the course of events? Several hands went up and Michelle called on a few students. One said, "A leader is someone who inspires others." Another added, "A leader is someone who takes responsibility." Michelle nodded encouragingly, but as she turned to the board again, she saw Donald still staring at his phone, completely ignoring the discussion. She paused for a moment, considering how to handle it. She believed discipline was important, but she also knew humiliating a student in front of others could do more harm than good. She took a breath and spoke gently but firmly. "Donald, please put your phone away so you can join the class discussion." The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Donald, waiting to see how he would respond. He slowly lifted his eyes from the screen and smirked. "Why should I?" he asked casually, his tone filled with defiance. Some students exchanged nervous glances. A few even looked down at their desks, not wanting to witness what might come next. Michelle didn't raise her voice. She simply met Donald's gaze. "Because this is a classroom and you deserve to learn just like everyone else here. I don't want you to miss out." Her words were calm, but they carried weight. Donald shifted in his chair, clearly not expecting that response. Most teachers shouted at him or sent him out immediately. Michelle's approach was different. She wasn't fighting him. She was inviting him to be part of the lesson. Still, Donald wasn't ready to back down. He put his phone on the desk and crossed his arms, leaning back. "Leaders don't follow orders," he muttered. Michelle walked closer, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't stand over him, but she positioned herself nearby so that he knew she was serious. "True leaders," she said softly, "know when to listen. Even the greatest leaders in history had to learn before they could lead." For a brief moment, the classroom was still. The students watched the quiet exchange, sensing that something important was unfolding. Donald frowned, and though he didn't respond, he slid his phone into his pocket. Michelle smiled faintly and returned to the front of the room. "Now," she continued, "let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. What made him a leader during one of the most difficult times in American history?" Hands shot up again and the discussion resumed. The tension eased, but a subtle current of energy lingered in the room. Donald had been challenged, not with anger, but with respect. As the students shared their thoughts, Michelle kept one eye on Donald. He didn't participate, but he didn't disrupt either. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his jaw tight as if he was processing more than he let on. For Michelle, this was a small victory. She knew teaching wasn't about winning battles. It was about planting seeds. Maybe today was the day a seed would be planted in Donald's mind. The lesson went on for nearly an hour. The students read passages, asked questions, and even debated among themselves. Michelle guided them carefully, allowing their voices to fill the room. She believed that when students discovered ideas on their own, the lesson stayed with them longer. But just as the class was nearing its end, Donald shifted again. His foot tapped restlessly against the floor. He glanced at the clock, then at Michelle, and then back at his desk. The smirk returned to his face, and Michelle felt a familiar worry rise within her. She knew his patience was wearing thin. Still, she ended the class the way she always did, one with encouragement. Remember, she told them, leadership isn't about control. It's about character. It's about how you treat people even when it's hard. The bell rang and students began to pack up. Some hurried out, others lingered to ask questions. Donald, however, stayed seated for a moment longer. He stared at Michelle as though trying to figure her out. Finally, he stood and walked slowly toward the door. Michelle gave him a small nod, not forcing conversation. She believed sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Donald left without a word, but his expression carried something new, a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Outside in the hallway, the chatter of students filled the air again, but Michelle remained in the classroom for a moment, reflecting. She knew challenges were coming. Donald was not finished testing boundaries. Yet she also knew something important. He had listened, even if only for a moment. And sometimes, one moment was enough to change the course of a story. The following day at Lincoln High School carried the same rhythm as always. Chatter in the hallways, footsteps echoing on the stairs, lockers slamming shut. But inside room 204, something felt different. A quiet tension hung in the air, like the moments before a storm. Ms. Michelle Obama stood at her desk, arranging her notes for the day's lesson. Her calm presence was a steady anchor for the students who walked into the room. Some smiled and greeted her warmly, while others slid into their seats quietly. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the rows of desks, and then came Donald. He entered the classroom with his usual confident stride, but today there was a sharpness in his steps. His jaw was tight, and his eyes darted around as if searching for something to push against. His classmates noticed it right away. The ones sitting near him stiffened, quietly shifting their chairs to create distance. Donald sat down heavily, tossing his backpack onto the desk. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling without hesitation, daring someone to call him out. He thrived on attention, and today he seemed determined to claim it. Michelle noticed, of course. She always did. But instead of addressing him immediately, she began her lesson. Good morning, class. Today we'll continue our discussion on leadership. Yesterday we talked about Abraham Lincoln. Today let's look at Martin Luther King Jr. What made him such a powerful leader even without holding a political office? Several hands shot up. A student near the front said, he inspired people with his words. Another added, he stayed peaceful even when others were angry. Michelle nodded, her eyes glowing with approval. Exactly, she said. True leadership isn't about force. It's about guiding others through example. Dr. King showed that strength can be found in patience, vision, and courage. The students leaned in, drawn to her words. But Donald leaned back, tapping his phone loudly against the desk. The noise broke the flow of the discussion. A few students glanced at him nervously, but no one dared to comment. Michelle walked slowly toward his desk, her steps steady. Donald, she said gently, please put the phone away. We're discussing something important, and I'd like you to be part of it. Donald lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. Why do you always pick on me? He asked, his voice louder than necessary. The class fell silent. Every eye turned to the back corner where Donald sat. Michelle kept her voice calm. I'm not picking on you. I'm inviting you to learn with us. You have thoughts worth sharing too. For a brief moment, Donald blinked, caught off guard by her kindness. Most teachers answered his defiance with anger or punishment. Michelle's approach unsettled him. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. He placed the phone in his lap but didn't put it away completely. Michelle gave him a small nod and returned to the front. She continued the lesson, guiding the students into a discussion about speeches, courage, and the power of peaceful resistance. But the tension did not leave the room. Donald's restless energy grew with each passing minute. His foot tapped loudly, his chair scraped against the floor, and he muttered under his breath whenever someone else spoke. By the middle of the class, the strain was impossible to ignore. Michelle paused and looked directly at him. "Donald," she said, "would you like to share your thoughts on leadership? What do you think makes someone a true leader?" The question caught him by surprise. He wasn't expecting to be asked, and for a moment he didn't answer. The class waited. Finally, Donald smirked and said, "Leaders don't follow rules. Leaders do what they want." A few students giggled nervously, but Michelle's expression didn't change. She nodded thoughtfully, as though his answer deserved real consideration. "That's one way to look at it," she said. "But think about this. If leaders only do what they want, who would trust them? Real leaders earn trust by showing responsibility. Without trust, leadership becomes empty." Her words landed heavier than anyone expected. The room grew still again. Donald shifted in his chair, clearly wrestling with the idea. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might dissolve, but then, as if pushed by an invisible force, Donald stood up suddenly. His chair screeched against the floor, making the entire class jump. He stood tall, his shoulders stiff, his expression hard. "I don't need trust," he said loudly. "I don't need anyone telling me how to act." The students stared in shock. Some leaned back in their seats, others looked toward the door, wondering if they should call for help. Michelle, however, remained calm. Her face showed no fear, only quiet determination. She took a small step closer to him. "Donald," she said softly, "this is not about control. This is about your future. Every choice you make shapes where you will go." Her words were steady, but Donald was boiling inside. The walls seemed to close in on him. He had always been the strongest voice in the room. But here was a teacher who refused to bend, who refused to shout, who refused to give him the chaos he thrived on. In a rush of emotion, he raised his hand in frustration, not to harm but to demand attention. His classmates gasped, frozen in their seats. For a split second, the room was filled with fear, but Michelle did not flinch. She stood firm, her eyes locked on his. Her voice was calm but carried an authority that silenced the entire room. "Donald," she said, "you don't need to fight me. You need to fight for yourself, for the person you want to be." The room was so quiet that the ticking of the classroom clock echoed against the walls. Donald's chest rose and fell quickly, his anger clashing with confusion. For the first time, he saw a teacher who wasn't scared of him, who wasn't angry at him, who simply believed he could be better. He froze. His hand lowered slowly and he stepped back, unsure of himself. The class exhaled collectively, the tension easing slightly. Michelle gave him a small nod, then turned back to the class. "Let's take a 5-minute break," she said gently. The students shuffled out quietly, whispering to one another, glancing back at Donald with wide eyes. Michelle stayed behind, her hands folded calmly. She didn't call security. She didn't scold. She simply gave space for calm to return. Donald remained standing for a few moments longer. His thoughts were a storm. He didn't understand why her words hit so deeply, why her calm made his anger feel empty. Slowly, he sat back down, staring at the desk in silence. When the bell finally rang and the students returned, Michelle continued the lesson as though nothing had happened. She spoke of leaders who faced anger with patience, who turned conflict into opportunity. Every student listened intently, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Donald stayed quiet for the rest of the class. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of thoughtfulness that none of his classmates had seen before. As the students left at the end of the period, Donald lingered for a moment. He glanced at Michelle, but words failed him. She gave him a gentle smile, not forcing a conversation. He walked out silently, carrying with him a weight he couldn't quite explain. And so the boiling point passed, not with shouting, not with punishment, but with calm strength. It was a moment that would stay in the minds of every student who had witnessed it. For Donald, it was the first crack in the shield he had built around himself. And for Michelle, it was proof of what she already knew. True leadership is not about power. It is about the ability to remain steady when storms rage. The next week at Lincoln High began with gray skies and cool winds sweeping across the campus. The weather seemed to echo the mood in room 204. Students still whispered about what had happened during Michelle Obama's class the week before. Some told the story with wide eyes, their voices hushed, as if they were recalling something unbelievable. Others kept quiet, unsure of how to even explain the calm way their teacher had handled Donald when his temper nearly boiled over. Michelle, however, walked into the classroom with her usual warmth. She placed her bag on the desk, organized her notes, and wrote the day's topic on the board: leadership in times of conflict. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate and steady, much like the way she carried herself. Students entered one by one, some greeting her, some too shy to speak, but nearly all of them looked at her differently now. Their eyes carried a kind of respect that went beyond the usual boundaries of student and teacher. They had seen strength in her, not the kind that comes from raising a voice or demanding obedience, but the kind that comes from patience and self-control. Donald arrived late, as usual. The room grew quieter when he walked in. He didn't say anything, but his steps were heavier, slower. He dropped into his chair and folded his arms, his expression unreadable. His classmates avoided eye contact with him, but many of them glanced at Michelle, wondering how she would handle him today. Michelle simply gave Donald a small nod. "Good morning," she said to the class. "Good morning, Ms. Obama," the students replied. She began the lesson with a story. "Imagine a time," she said, "when a leader is faced with anger, fear, and chaos. Imagine thousands of people looking to them for guidance. In those moments, what do you think matters most?" A hand went up. "Courage?" A student offered. "Patience?" Another suggested. Michelle smiled. "Both are important, but the most powerful quality is calm, because when people see calmness, they find strength in it." The students listened closely, their eyes following her every move. Donald tapped his pen against his desk but said nothing. Michelle's words didn't come from a textbook. They came from experience. Experiences no one in that room knew about. Years earlier, before she became a teacher, Michelle had been part of a special leadership program. It was a training experience where she had learned directly from Navy SEAL instructors. She hadn't gone through full military service, but she had learned lessons that stayed with her forever: discipline, resilience, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Those lessons had shaped her life. They had given her a strength that few people could see from the outside. To her students, she was just Ms. Obama, their history teacher. But inside her was a foundation built on training that tested both body and mind. As the lesson went on, Michelle asked the students to form small groups. They were tasked with discussing moments in history when leaders turned conflict into peace. Students huddled together, sharing ideas about presidents, activists, and explorers. The room buzzed with conversation. Donald, however, sat alone. No one dared to invite him into their group. He didn't ask to join either. He leaned back in his chair, arms still crossed, eyes wandering around the room. Michelle noticed. She walked over and crouched slightly beside his desk, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You have a voice, Donald. You don't need to sit apart. You could teach others something if you shared your thoughts." Donald's jaw tightened. "Nobody wants me in their group," he muttered. Michelle's heart softened. For the first time, she saw not defiance in his eyes, but something else: loneliness. "Then make your own," she said kindly. "Lead the discussion. You don't always need permission to step forward." Her words surprised him. He didn't respond, but he sat a little straighter. When the group work ended, Michelle invited students to share their discussions. One by one, groups spoke about leaders who showed patience, who built peace instead of war. Donald stayed quiet, but Michelle noticed the way he leaned forward slightly, as if listening more closely than before. By the end of class, she wrapped up the discussion with a reminder. Leadership isn't measured by how loud you are or how much control you have. Leadership is measured by how you lift others, even when it's difficult. The bell rang and students filed out. Donald lingered as he had before. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Michelle didn't press him. She simply smiled and said, "See you tomorrow." That evening, as Michelle walked home, she thought about Donald. His anger wasn't simple rebellion. She could sense something deeper, a struggle he carried but didn't know how to express. She remembered the lessons she had learned during her own training, that people often hide fear behind aggression, that the ones who push the hardest are often the ones who need the most guidance. She resolved not to give up on him. The next day, things took a sharper turn. The students entered quietly, the memory of the previous week still fresh. Michelle started class as usual, but Donald's restlessness grew stronger. He shifted in his seat, muttered under his breath, and finally slammed his notebook shut in frustration. "Donald," Michelle said gently, "is something wrong?" His eyes flashed. "Why do you care?" The room froze. Students stared at him, waiting for Michelle's response. She didn't answer right away. She studied him, her face calm, her voice steady. "Because you matter," she said simply. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything she had said before. Donald blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever told him that in such a straightforward way, but instead of softening, his pride pushed back. He stood up suddenly, his chair crashing against the floor. "I don't need anyone to care," he shouted. Gasps filled the room. Students gripped their desks, unsure of what would happen next. Michelle, however, remained still. Her eyes stayed on him, unwavering. Her training echoed in her mind, "Stay calm. Control the space. Do not let fear decide your actions." "Donald," she said, her tone firm but calm, "sit down. This isn't who you are." Her words carried authority, not from power but from certainty. The class held its breath. For a long moment, Donald hesitated. His fists clenched, his chest rose and fell rapidly. But Michelle's calmness held him still. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She simply stood her ground, her presence stronger than his storm. Finally, he lowered his eyes and sat back down heavily. His anger hadn't disappeared, but something in him had shifted. The students stared at Michelle with awe. They had never seen anyone face Donald's temper like that. It was as if she carried an invisible strength, something far greater than physical power. Michelle picked up the lesson where she had left off, as though nothing had happened. Her voice was steady, her words measured, her presence unshaken. But inside, she knew the story was only beginning. Donald was at a breaking point. His anger was more than classroom misbehavior. It was a storm building inside him. And storms, she knew, could either destroy or be transformed into something new. That night, Michelle reflected again. Her SEAL training had taught her that real strength wasn't about fighting back. It was about understanding, about meeting force with calm, about seeing beyond the surface. Donald wasn't just a bully. He was a young man searching for direction, for identity, for someone to believe in him. She made a quiet promise to herself. She would not let him slip away into anger and regret. She would use everything she had learned, in the classroom, in her training and in life, and to guide him toward something better. And so, the hidden strength she carried, the strength no one else knew about, was about to play a bigger role than anyone could imagine. Because sometimes, the strongest lessons are not found in books. They are found in the courage to stand firm when others fall apart. The week after Donald's outburst was heavy with silence at Lincoln High. Students whispered about what had happened, but no one dared to speak of it when Donald was near. He walked through the halls with his usual confident stride, yet something in his eyes looked unsettled. In room 204, Michelle Obama prepared for another day of teaching. She arranged her notes, straightened the books on her desk, and glanced at the clock. She could feel the tension in the building, but she carried herself with the same calmness as always. When the students filed in, their chatter was softer than usual. They sat quickly, books open, pencils ready, as if sensing the weight of the days before. Donald entered last. His footsteps were slower this time, his usual smirk missing. He dropped into his chair without a word. His classmates avoided looking at him, but their curiosity was obvious. Would he challenge the teacher again? Would something else happen? Michelle greeted the class warmly. "Good morning," she said, her voice even and calm. "Good morning, Ms. Obama," they replied. She wrote the day's topic on the board, choices and consequences. The words stood out boldly in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. "Today," Michelle began, "we're going to talk about how the choices we make shape our future. Every choice has a consequence, some small, some life-changing. Leaders know this. They understand that even one decision can open doors or close them." The students leaned forward, sensing that this lesson carried more weight than the usual discussion of history. Michelle continued, weaving examples from history into her talk. She spoke of presidents, activists, and inventors who faced moments of decision. She asked the students to imagine how different the world might be if those people had chosen differently. Then she paused and looked around the room. "And what about you?" she asked. "What choices will you make?" What kind of story will your life tell? The classroom was silent. Some students glanced at Donald. Others looked down at their desks. Donald shifted in his seat. He could feel their eyes on him. His pride told him to smirk, to act as though he didn't care. But something inside him twisted. He remembered Michelle's calm gaze, the way she had faced him without fear. For the first time, he wondered what kind of story his choices were writing. Michelle went on, her voice gentle but strong. Sometimes we think we're only hurting others with our choices, but often the person we hurt most is ourselves. Anger, pride, carelessness, and they can take away opportunities we might never get back. Her words struck Donald like stones. He thought of the football team. He had been one of the strongest players, and scouts had begun to notice him. But after his behavior in class, the coaches had pulled him aside. They told him his actions were being watched, that one wrong step could cost him his future. The thought weighed on him more than he admitted. He had always believed he could get away with anything. But for the first time, he realized he could lose something important. Michelle asked the students to write a short reflection. What choice in your life has shaped who you are today? The class grew quiet as pencils scratched against paper. Donald stared at the blank sheet in front of him. His chest tightened. He wanted to write something, but no words came. He folded his arms and leaned back, trying to look unconcerned. But inside, he felt the weight of choices pressing down on him. When the bell rang, students gathered their things and left. Donald lingered again, his paper still blank. Michelle walked toward him, her steps unhurried. You didn't write today, she said gently. Donald shrugged. Didn't have anything to say. Michelle tilted her head slightly. Or maybe you had too much to say. For a moment, Donald looked at her. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only patience. It unsettled him. He grabbed his backpack and left without a word. That afternoon, word spread quickly through the school. Donald had been called into the principal's office. The administration had reviewed his behavior, and his football coach had joined the meeting. When Donald walked out later, his face was pale. The news had been clear. If he had another outburst, if he disrespected another teacher, his place on the football team would be gone. And without football, his chances at a scholarship would disappear. The warning cut deeper than anything else had before. For the first time, Donald realized that his actions carried real consequences. His anger, his defiance, his pride, they were costing him more than attention. They were threatening his future. That evening, he sat alone in his room, the glow of his phone screen lighting his face. Messages from friends buzzed in, jokes, gossip, plans for the weekend. But Donald barely read them. He tossed the phone aside and stared at the ceiling. He thought of Michelle's words. Every choice has a consequence. He thought of the calm strength in her eyes when he had shouted. He thought of the way she had told him, "This isn't who you are." For the first time, he began to wonder, who am I really? The next day, Donald entered room 204 quietly. He didn't slam his chair, didn't pull out his phone. He just sat. His classmates noticed, exchanging surprised glances. Michelle noticed too, but she didn't draw attention to it. She simply began the lesson. Throughout the class, Donald stayed quiet. He listened, though he didn't join the discussion. He tapped his pen against his desk, but softly, almost absent-mindedly. Something in him was shifting. At the end of class, as students packed up, Michelle spoke. Remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about growing. It's about recognizing mistakes and choosing better the next time. Her eyes met Donald's for just a moment. He looked away quickly, but her words stayed with him. Later that week, the football team gathered for practice. Donald usually dominated the field, his strength and speed setting him apart. But that day, his coach pulled him aside. "You're a leader on this team," the coach said. "But leadership isn't just about scoring touchdowns. It's about how you carry yourself off the field. Right now, you're at a crossroads. You either step up or you lose everything you've worked for." Donald nodded silently. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But deep down, he knew the coach was right. Back in the classroom, the students began to notice small changes. Donald still had his sharp edges, but he no longer disrupted every lesson. He stayed in his seat, kept his phone away more often, and sometimes even listened without scowling. One afternoon, when Michelle asked a question, Donald surprised everyone by raising his hand. "A leader," he began slowly, his voice uncertain. "A leader. doesn't always get what they want. Sometimes they have to do what's best for everyone else. The room went silent. His classmates stared in shock. Michelle's eyes softened with pride. "That's a powerful answer, Donald," she said. For the first time, Donald felt something different in the room, and not fear. Not attention, but respect. The turning point had come quietly, almost invisibly. A choice had been made, not with grand gestures, but with small steps. Michelle knew his journey was far from over. There would be more struggles, more moments when his pride would try to pull him back. But she also knew he had crossed a threshold. He had seen the edge of what his choices could cost him, and he had begun to step in a new direction. For Donald, the storm inside him was still there, but now he had seen something stronger than anger, calm strength. And that strength had shown him a new path. The boy who had once thrived on chaos now faced the truth. His future depended on the choices he made from this moment forward. And for Michelle, it was proof once again that patience, respect, and quiet strength could change even the most troubled heart. The final months of the school year moved quickly at Lincoln High School. The flowers outside the windows of room 204 bloomed brightly, and the air carried the warmth of spring. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted too. Where once there had been tension and fear, there was now a sense of calm and respect. Michelle Obama continued her lessons as she always had, steady, patient, and inspiring. But something was different. The students now saw her not just as a teacher, but as someone who lived her words. They respected her in a deeper way, carrying her lessons in their hearts. And at the center of this quiet transformation was Donald. Donald had not become a perfect student overnight. He still struggled with his temper, still carried pride in his shoulders, still had moments where his sharp tongue wanted to take control. But something inside him had shifted after the turning point. He began to think more before he acted. He no longer stormed into the classroom with noise and defiance.
He kept his phone away most of the time.
And once in a while, he even raised his hand to answer questions his classmates noticed. They no longer shrank away from him in fear. Instead, some began to include him in their group discussions. A few even asked his opinion on assignments. Respect was replacing fear slowly but surely. Michelle noticed too. She never praised him in a way that embarrassed him, but she encouraged him gently. Each time Donald showed effort, she gave him a nod, a smile, or a simple, "good thought." Those small words meant more to him than he let on. One afternoon, Michelle gave the class an assignment. Write about the leader who has influenced you most, and explain why. The students bent over their notebooks, pens moving across paper. Donald stared at the blank page for a long time. He thought of athletes he admired, of famous people he had once bragged about. But his pen didn't move. None of those names felt right anymore. Finally, slowly, he began to write. He didn't write about a celebrity. He didn't write about a president. He wrote about a teacher. He wrote about someone who faced his anger with calm, someone who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. It wasn't a long essay, and the words were simple, but when Michelle read it later that night, her eyes softened. She didn't need grand sentences to see what it meant. It was proof that something inside Donald was changing, but life has a way of testing people after they start to grow. A week later, Donald faced a moment that could have pulled him back. During lunch in the cafeteria, another student mocked him loudly, trying to provoke him. In the past, Donald would have stood up, shouted, and maybe even thrown something. Everyone braced themselves, waiting for the explosion. But this time, Donald froze. Michelle's words echoed in his mind. Every choice has a consequence. His coach's warning returned too. Step up or lose everything. Instead of reacting, he stood slowly, took a deep breath, and walked away. The cafeteria was stunned. For the first time, Donald had chosen calm over chaos. Later, a few of his teammates clapped him on the back. "That was smart," one said. Another added, "Took strength to walk away." Donald didn't say much, but inside he felt something new, pride, not from anger but from self-control. As the year neared its end, the football team had their final game of the season. Donald played with focus and discipline. His coach noticed the difference. He wasn't just strong on the field. He was learning to be strong off it too. After the game, the coach called him aside. "You're growing, Donald. I've seen it. If you keep this up, you'll have real opportunities ahead of you." But remember, it's not just about football. It's about the man you choose to be. Donald nodded, his chest tight with both pride and responsibility. Back in room 204, the students prepared for their final history exam. Michelle stood before them one last time that year. The sunlight filled the classroom and the atmosphere was lighter than it had ever been. "I want you to remember something," she told them. "History isn't just about the past. It's about the choices people made, choices that shape the world we live in. And your own life is part of history too. Every decision you make will shape your story. Ask yourself, what kind of story do you want others to remember about you?" The students listened closely. Some nodded, some smiled, and some simply absorbed the weight of her words. Donald sat quietly, but he was listening more carefully than anyone. Her words felt like they were meant for him, as if she could see straight into the storm he was still learning to control. The school year ended, and summer arrived. Students said goodbye, hugging friends, signing yearbooks, and promising to stay in touch. Donald didn't say much, but before leaving, he lingered at the door of room 204. Michelle was gathering her books when she looked up and saw him. He hesitated, then said thanks. It was just one word, but it carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. Michelle smiled warmly. "You're welcome, Donald. Remember, your story is still being written. Make it one you'll be proud of." He nodded and walked away, his footsteps slower, steadier than they had been at the start of the year. Years later, Donald would look back on that classroom as the place where his life began to change. He didn't become perfect, but he became better. He learned to control his anger, to think before acting, and to respect the people who believed in him. And in quiet moments, he would remember the calm strength of a teacher who once faced him at his worst and still saw who he could be at his best. For Michelle, the lesson was just as lasting. Teaching was never about controlling students. It was about guiding them, about planting seeds that might not grow right away but would one day bear fruit. She knew that the classroom wasn't just a place for history lessons. It was a place where lives were shaped, where storms were calmed, and where hidden strengths could rise to the surface. The story of Donald and Michelle became more than just a memory of one school year. It was a reminder for everyone who heard it that respect is stronger than fear, that calm is stronger than anger, and that true leadership, the kind that changes lives, begins not with power, but with patience, integrity, and belief. And so, in the quiet walls of room 204, a lasting lesson was written, one that no textbook could ever teach, but one that would live in the hearts of those students forever.